There's some autobiographical information. Mike will either be a hero to some and a villain to others, because without Mike, I would not be here. No, he's not my father. But he is responsible for inviting me to the Conference on World Affairs. I was invited because of the goodwill Mike generated, and the reason I was on the University of Colorado's radar screen even in the first place to get that position was because of Mike Franc. So this may be a source of discord this evening, that he has to bear that responsibility, but I have to set the record straight. Mike is going to speak probably for 40 or 45 minutes, answer questions. There'll be a reception. Just one person I'd like to acknowledge that has made this program possible. I'd like you to stand, Regent Carlson. Without regents like this, there wouldn't be programs like this. So thank you very much for me being here and for making possible Mike and the other great speakers. Without further ado, the great Mike Franc.
Thank you, Bob. I hope it's not a bad omen, but what is that? If you think about it, right? Welcome to hell. I've never had a room with that kind of a welcome. So let's start from scratch here. You know, I get obsessed about certain things in Washington. I love studying Congress as an institution. I have always I've had the privilege of working in jobs where I've gotten to know literally hundreds of members of Congress, most on the House side, but many in the Senate as well, many from the House who went into the Senate. And I saw them come in as freshmen, even member-elect at these orientations that I used to run for the Heritage Foundation. And I'd watch them mature and move through the legislative kind of hierarchy and become experts at things, distinguish themselves on committees, develop their priorities, become chairman, in one case speaker. And so I've always wondered, you know, you get to know them, you get to understand what makes them tick policy-wise, what their focus is, how they react to different situations. And at one point, about 12 years ago, I had a chance to get access to, through some of the economists I was working with, a congressional district-based breakout of a lot of tax data. You know, who claimed capital gains, how many, what mortgage interest deductions were like, income levels, and all that. And I'd never seen this stuff before, and even the levels in the breakouts went beyond what was publicly available from the census. So it was, you had to have a license to get the information, and our economists had that license, and I started studying that. And I was really struck by, when I was fascinated by this, there was a category of income, $200,000 household income and above. And at the time, the only thing publicly available was 100 and above. So when you start looking at the 200 and above, I was just taken aback at how many congressional districts with a lot of these households had Democrats representing them in Washington. I think it was something like 17 of the 25 districts with the most of that category. And I thought, this is kind of interesting. So I started pursuing that in more detail and more depth with other criteria. And I started noticing these patterns. And the funny thing was, it struck me that the rhetoric you would hear in different policy debates was very different from what I was seeing in all this data. So the normal line, which you even hear today in back and forth on the tax bill. The Republicans are the party of the rich. They only care about the top 1% of people who are in income. They're the country club party, that kind of thing. But when you looked at the data, the kind of constituencies they went home to on weekends and during recesses couldn't be more different than that. Yeah, there were some members that had these constituencies with a lot of wealthy suburban communities in it. But even those were the members that tended to be on the so-called watch list when votes were coming up. So if you were in leadership and you had to worry about some bill that might have had a conservative policy orientation, the 12, 15, 20 Republicans that were the most likely to want to vote against that tended to be from these constituencies that were disproportionately affluent and so on. So when you started looking at other criteria, it worked out for education. It worked out for things like percentage of employment in manufacturing in a district. It worked out for, interestingly, and maybe most completely for the percentage of married couples in a district. So it was, in the Census Bureau, it was currently married, not separated, is how they defined it. I think age 15 and above. And it basically was off the charts correlated. The more of these couples you had in the district, the more likely you were to get a Republican. The fewer of those couples, the more likely you were to get a Democrat. And there were some other of these trend lines as well. Also, we often wondered, there was a time when every issue debated on the floor. This is when I was a few years back working for Kevin McCarthy. Economic inequality always came up. And it was a big talking point. And then there was one of the criteria you could look at district by district was something called Gini coefficient. You know what that is? It's a way to measure two different things that are different, the coincidence of these two different things. And for economics, it's a lot of rich, a lot of poor. And when you found the coincidence of that, there was an incredible correlation. It was something like 40, I think 2 or 3 or 4 out of the top 50 of these districts with the most inequality were represented by Democrats, mostly from big cities. So you had a lot from New York City, basically like Manhattan, where you had a lot of rich and a lot of poor, but not much of a middle in the economic distribution. Beverly Hills was in that, San Francisco was in that, Chicago's inner city areas were in that, along with the coastal areas with the big, fancy $2 million, $3 million condos. And they kind of members who were representing those seats tended to be like literally 100% Americans for Democratic Action scorecard liberals. Fine, but it was an interesting correlation. Like almost all of them, it wasn't just a member who might have been a 70 or 80 or 90%, it was 100% across the board in these districts. The district in the other extreme was really funny, I thought, too. The other extreme was an interesting member. And one time I was doing a briefing for a group of students who were interns that summer as a favor for a friend when I was working for McCarthy, and there was like 15 of them in the room. And I asked them to go around the table, who are you working for and what are you working on this summer? And these two nice young women were working at the Center for American Progress. And well, what are you working on? Economic inequality. Oh, that's interesting. So as the conversation continued, and I finally said, I was telling them what I just told you, and then I said, and I looked at them, I said, do you know which district has the most economic equality in the entire country? No. I said, it's the district in Minnesota represented by Michelle Bachmann. And if you remember Michelle Bachmann, she was this bête noire of the left, right? And I said, so what you're really doing is you're trying to turn the entire country into a constituency that would elect a lot more Michelle Bachmanns. No, that's not what we want. I said, well, this is the way it works out. So anyway, so you had these kinds of delineations in it. And I have a working document here that's getting bigger and bigger, and a lot of charts and numbers. I can run some of them past you. But the correlation is so dramatic. I mean, an example is on marriage, there's a break point of something like, I think it was like 30-something%, 33.5%, something like that. And if you're that or above, it's something like 70+% of those districts, like over 200 of them, are represented by Republicans. If you're below that number, is, again, 200 and whatever districts, and that they're disproportionately represented by Democrats, maybe 60% or something. But at the very bottom, where there's very little marriage, it was something like, I think there were 66 districts, all but 4 of them were Democratic held seats. And these kind of things they start telling a story. And you can say, well, gerrymandering is something to do with this. Well, maybe, but what it does tell you is that if you're in the room with the big map of your constituencies and you're trying to draw lines and you want to elect a certain kind of member, you kind of, whether they do this consciously or not, the data was telling me that if you want to design a district that's going to likely send a Republican to Congress, and as they were currently defined, it may be different now, which is a whole other discussion. You want to get a district with a lot of veterans. Huge correlation there. You want a lot of manufacturing employment, if there is any. It's basically, if it's over about 12%, you get about 3/4 of those seats are going to be represented by Republicans. If you get up toward about 16%, it's in the 80s, like 85%. Okay. You want to have a district with a lot of married couples. You want a district with incomes between about $35,000 and $100,000. Right now, if you look at the districts with $35,000 to $100,000 incomes, the top 100, 91 have Republicans. Where there's a heavy concentration of these middle-income families or units, you get Republican representation. The other extreme, because that, by definition, crowds out, at both top and bottom levels, you get much higher levels of Democratic members coming from those districts. So you want to design a district, you kind of want to get the high-low, and the Republicans get that middle, okay? And so you say, well, that's actually, is that a good or a bad bet? For the Republicans, it's not necessarily a good bet because manufacturing employment is a stock that's kind of going down as a demographic category. I think 5 million fewer jobs since the year 2000 in manufacturing. You look at something like military service, because of the draft that's gone. Military service, by the way, means anybody who served. It could be Vietnam War, Korean War, all the way up to the future. Anyone from World War II, for example. It doesn't have to just mean currently in the military. And since the draft ended, those numbers have been going down as a percentage of the population. So that number over time is diminished and will diminish even more. And there's one or two other of those categories. Marriage is actually gone down, I think, by 10, 11 percentage points in the population in the last 30 years or so. So the Republicans kind of have this core constituency that seems to like whatever their candidates say that are in the decline. And that actually was part of, I think, the core thesis for the emerging Democratic majority by Rui Teixeira from Center for American Progress, back when he was with, I think, Brookings. But you have these dynamics, and it is, to me, interesting. I'll tell you one more thing that we looked at. Looked at the districts in 2016 election. That there's two categories. So there's 23 seats with Republicans that voted for Hillary Clinton, gave them majorities, and 12 seats that have Democrats in that voted for Trump. And when you look at those, for example, there are 76% of the people in the Trump Democratic seats at 100,000 or below, and it's 66%. So it's about a 10-point difference there for the GOP seats that Clinton represented, and it's a flip for over 100. And at over 200, there's 4% of the people in the Trump Democratic seats had incomes over 200, and 10%, 2.5 times that in the Republican seats that Clinton won. Education is much more stark in a way. The Republicans dominate in districts with people who have high school degrees, some college, but didn't finish college, and an associate degree. Just put those three categories together, and when you run it, and then you press sort on your spreadsheet, if you have Republicans in kind of a red color and Democrats in a blue color, you get the sea of red at the top for those three categories. And interestingly, the district, if you follow this stuff closely, with the heaviest concentration of those three categories, 72% of the constituents fit in one of those three categories, is represented in Ohio by a guy named Jim Jordan, who was the head of the Freedom Caucus until recently, and I like him, a great guy, nice fella, wrestler. I never met wrestlers until I met him, and he practices politics the way I think he was a championship wrestler, how he got there. But it's districts like that that are dominated by people who completed high school, so they showed a certain level of sticking with it, but they had to get out or something happened, but they never had a chance to complete college, and they certainly did not go to grad school. And then the flip of that would be the seats that have a lot of people with graduate degrees, very high correlation there across the board, and a lot of people who didn't finish high school. If you add those two together, you get a Democratic sweet spot when it comes to education. And that turned out to be the case with respect to the districts, kind of like, if you want to think of districts that could sort themselves even further, the demographics, usually you look at those districts anyway. If a Republican wins a Democratic seat presidentially, the campaign arm usually will target that seat no matter what. Well, if you look at the demographics, it actually makes a lot of sense to do that for these seats, both the 23 and the 12 in each instance. There's a lot of other ways you can break this stuff out that tell that story in different ways, shapes, and forms. It translates into policy. Give you an example. Tax bill that's moving through right now. If you look at, this is a fun thing that now as the census does have, it's the number of people in a district with mortgages in certain ranges, right? And you can actually look at how many people have mortgages of 500 or over. So if you know what's going on, some of these details in the tax bill, the House bill takes the amount of interest you can, of a mortgage you can deduct on interest from $1 million down to $500,000. And so here's the big picture. When you look at median home value by congressional district, you see the same story. If it's 100,000 or less, is about 2/3 of those seats are represented by Democrats. From 100,000 to 218,000, for some reason it ends at 218,000. There's over like 260 or 70 seats, and 3/4 of those roughly are Republican. That's their sweet spot. It's all the leadership of the Republican House. McCarthy is 228, he's a little bit over it now, 228. Ryan, Kathy McMorris Rodgers, Steve Scalise are all between 180 and 195. And then one other guy, Luke Messer, is like 130. The Democrats have, when you go from 218 to 275, they overrepresent. They're about 40, and this is from last Congress, 43% of the seats. They had 54% of those districts. But 275 and over, it's about 3/4 or 70% Democratic seats. So when you find the more affluent seats, the 75 to 100 seats at the top end, it's almost all Democratic representation. So when you look at the politics of, okay, we need to raise money to offset, we want to lower rates, we want to increase the child tax credit, whatever, you look at that, you say, well, where do we get the money from? Well, the mortgages that are really, really high, and I know Boulder is going to be affected by this, obviously, but why not go there politically if you want to get revenue to offset, to double the child tax credit, let's say, or increase the standard deduction? And sure enough, that's where they go. Pelosi's district now, the median home value is $1,053,000. Okay, the next, Steny Hoyer, who's the #2 person in the leadership, is something like in the mid to high threes. Joe Crowley, who's from Queens, is one of the leaders as well. It's something like 500 and change. So basically, if you did a spreadsheet, you see these dots way on the outlier side, and they have a lot of homes over 500,000 with over 500,000 mortgages. So those kind of districts are affected. And if you're, I don't know if this is happening. I kind of doubt it. But if you were to look at that kind of data, you'd say, well, the people who are going to vote against the bill anyway are most affected. Why not get money out of those districts? You see, you can see the politics play. And doubling the child tax credit is another way to, Republican districts tend to have a lot of more, families with children between 35 and 100, 150, that range. So why not reward those families with a bigger tax credit, even if it may not yield growth, which is another discussion. So you can see how, like, all these different parameters, you kind of get that high-low thing going as a coalitional strategy for the Democrats, whether they have done this consciously or not, they're succeeding at it, and then this middle, for the Republicans. And I'm noticing that it's starting to play out in various, debates. Even manufacturing, think about trade. Trade is one of those issues that's flipped. You look at polls from 20, 25 years ago, Republicans were very much, in favor of a free trade concept, if not trade deals themselves, and is trade good or bad for the future of the country? Is it going to increase the economy, that kind of thing? Republicans tended to say yes to that. Today, they're not. Today, they've kind of gone another direction. Is that because they're taking their lead from President Trump as a candidate, or is it because the way the sorting has gone on in these constituencies that members going back to districts where at town hall meetings, they may be hearing a lot more angst about the effects of trade on their job or their factory closing or stagnant wages, why their kids are taking opiates or whatever. Democrats now like trade. And is that because President Obama was involved in some trade agreement negotiations and they saw that in the news? Or is it because they suddenly have said, trade's a good thing. We want to embrace the rest of the world. We don't want to be more insular. So these demographics tend to, it may have a lag effect, but it tends over time to yield policy consequences. And those are just a couple of examples of kind of how it's playing out. What to do about it? I think one thing I'd like is the rhetoric to change, personally, because I think it's kind of odd that Chuck Schumer goes to the floor and rants and raves about, the party of the rich and country club Republicans, and then simultaneously is saying how terrible it is to get rid of the state and local tax deduction or limit property tax deductions or mortgage interest deductions because of a disproportionate effect on Manhattan and parts of Queens and obviously these days, I never thought I'd say this, Brooklyn. Brooklyn is now a hipster, affluent haven. Brooklyn used to be the dregs of society, but no offense if you grew up in Brooklyn. I'm from Manhattan. So simultaneously you can have two different, it's a little cognitive dissonance, two different messages going back and forth on this. I'd just like to see the rhetoric align itself with those kinds of realities. So anyway, I'll stop there, and I'm sure you have a lot of questions because I know some of you, and it's good to see you, all you guys. Yes, sir.
Do you see a difference in commitment between rural people and urban and suburban people?
Yeah. Yeah, when you have a really rural district, with very few exceptions, it's open season for Republicans to get those seats. So, if you look at those Trump districts that Democrats currently represent, 3 of them are in Minnesota. Colin Peterson, Richard Nolan, and who's the one other guy, and he won like by 20 to 30 points in those seats. Sherry Bustos in southern Illinois is another seat Trump won, and that's rural part of small town Illinois. There's Ron Kind in Wisconsin, same way, another one of those rural Wisconsin area districts. And there's a few more that fit that profile. There's a couple in Pennsylvania as well, in the central part of Pennsylvania. So the part of Pennsylvania that, what's his name, who married Mary Madeline Carville. James Carville once said Pennsylvania is Philadelphia in the east, Pittsburgh in the west, and Alabama in the middle. These are a couple of the Alabama districts in the middle that are tipping each way. And they are. I mean, I'm not sure what it is about, because I think if you were to take this kind of analysis to the next dimension, next level, you'd want to start looking at the attitudinal findings for those kind of demographic groups, especially region by region, and incorporate that into what's going on. Because, for example, why do districts with a lot of veterans tend to elect Republicans? What is it about having served in the military that correlates with that, or is it just coincidental? I'd like to know more about that, but you can't say causation just because of correlation, but you certainly want to do a little bit more levels of analysis, I think, to find that out. Yes, sir.
Yes, during the last election, I tried to keep emotions out of it and look into, and I discovered William Mead's writings, who talks about the Jacksonian populists.
Oh, yeah.
And
Russell Mead.
I'm sorry, Russell
Walter Russell Mead.
Walter Russell Mead, who talked both his essays then and since, and then I guess some.
Did you read his book?
I read that seminal paper in 1999 that he did, that some people say predicted the populism of Trump.
Yeah.
And it sounds like that would jive with a lot of what you're saying. Do you have?
I thought I read Special Providence after the election because after about the third person recommended it, I decided I had to read it. And his section on Jacksonian mindset and the attitudes really did seem like they had been, even though he wrote it, I think he wrote it right before 9/11 because there's no references to 9/11, I don't think, in the book. So it must have been like 2000, 2001 he was writing it. He was predicting this stuff. There's something about, the Trump mindset of the voters seems to have some combination of don't mess with us. If you hit me, I'm going to hit you back real hard, and you can support a strong military and all that. But you don't really want to go out looking for fights at the same time. And there's an insular look to it. And there's this sense of looking for others to blame too. The reason I lost my job is because of an immigrant or something. There's a combination of these instincts that combine into it. Does that get back to rural America? Does that reflect it? I don't know.
It's culture, it's values, it's the type of, even the type of foreign policy they will support.
The other thing I'd love to see the numbers. The Gallup does polls every year on trust in institutions. So everything from Congress, President, Supreme Court, but also banks, Wall Street, insurance companies, the military, law enforcement, churches, all these different institutions of police, and media, all different media categories. And the numbers have been steadily going down for 30 to 40 years. And I wonder to some extent how much that also plays into this. The lack of trust in so many institutions that used to be fairly well regarded has to make a difference. If 46% of Americans don't trust the media, that says a lot about what's going to be the effect of this breaking news story on the electorate. Well, half the country may not be paying attention or may not believe it because of where it's coming from, And I'm not sure that was the case before. I think before there was much more, Walter Cronkite was this haloed, figure. There's no Walter Cronkite anymore, for God's sakes, right?
That's based.
Yeah.
That lowers.
That lowers.
Would you care to comment about your perception of perhaps why those who climb higher in academia and into the field of wealth tend to go into the blue lane?
Good question. So one thing that I rue is whoever made the decision, I think it was financial, but the decision to not do exit polling in all 50 states in the last election. I think they did exit polling in about 17 states that were viewed as pivotal by someone's determination. Because when you look at exit polls prior to 16, especially like 08, 04, around then, and when I was starting to really look at this stuff, I was struck by, I was looking at the people with postgraduate degrees, how they voted, by state. There's actually a difference. If you went to some states like Texas or Oklahoma, the people with postgraduate degrees were not behaving at all like their counterparts in Massachusetts or California or New York. And I had a thesis about this, which again requires another layer of analysis and all that, which is what kind of PhDs are out there? Which kinds of graduate degrees are out there? If you have a graduate degree in mining and you're working in one of the extractive industries in one of the states, North Dakota, Texas, wherever, you're probably not going to have the same attitudes toward politics as somebody with a PhD in gender studies has, right? And so I think that's part of it, because there was a distinction in the voting behavior of that category, state by state, and a lot of the states in that middle that were red, people with PhDs or postgraduate degrees were voting for Bush, they were voting for Romney, or McCain, but I think I would look at that, because I think that what you study, what kind of training you get, has a little bit of an impact on that.
You talked about the vets several times. You brought that up. I read recently that by far the majority of our current volunteer military comes from the red states. Mm-hmm. And most of those are in the South. And someone had all these statistics, which I can't quote offhand, but they showed them, and it's dramatic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There were, very small proportion of our current military, not vets now, but the current military comes from blue states.
Yeah, in fact, there was a study, I'm sure somewhere on the website, but a guy named Tim Kaine, K-A-N-E, not the senator, who's an economist now at Hoover, but he had been at the Heritage Foundation, and he did an analysis of the data of the home, zip codes, of where the recruits came in, and he found the same thing, and he actually published it as a study, and that was maybe 2007 or 8 or something like that. And it was at the time when I think Charlie Rangel, the congressman from Harlem, was trying to put the draft back in because he said that too many of the recruits into the military were poor and were doing it out of necessity, and it was unfair and all that. He wanted to distribute the pain of military service more widely. And so Tim did this study, and basically it was the upside down. And when you looked at where they were likely to come from, there were certain communities in Iowa, that were off the charts sending young men and women into the military, and districts like Wrangel's, it didn't happen a whole lot. So yeah, I think there's a lot to back that up. I haven't seen anything like that done more recently.
The question is whether it's the chicken and the egg as far as the voting goes.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, it could be. Yeah, and it could be reinforcing it. The other part of it I wonder about too is if you're raised in a family, say you did not serve in the military, you're raised in a family, you have a couple of young kids, and then down the street or next door neighbor is a former Marine drill sergeant. You know, if that guy's going to ask my kid to mow the lawn, I think the kid's going to get a lesson in doing a full thorough job, you know, and that might be good for my kid to get that kind of lesson. So I'm just wondering about the values that they might bring to things they do post-military career. You know, if they become the high school football coach, if they work in a, you know, in a business in town, they're going to have certain, I would imagine, certain ways of engaging and in terms of respect and demanding excellence and whatever that might affect the community more broadly. Yeah.
I have a question. So shortly after the 2016 election, I read an article in the Compass magazine that presented statistics that said that districts that voted for Trump versus Clinton, the Trump districts had higher incidence of diabetes, heart disease, and other chronic diseases, and also higher rates of opioid use.
Yeah, makes sense.
Versus the ones that the districts that voted for Clinton. I was wondering if you looked at that or.
I haven't seen that, but I mean, it makes sense because of if you look at where the districts are, and you look at the some of the legislative efforts relating to the opiate epidemic, it overlaps regionally, at least. So I imagine those numbers are really true. And that is, by the way, one of the most frightening studies that I've ever read. If you haven't read it, there's a Angus Deaton study. Have you seen that? Well, Angus Deaton is a Princeton economist, won the Nobel, and he and his wife did a study about 2 or 3 years ago, and they found basically life expectancy among, I think it was white males, 45 to 54, from 1998 to 2013 had actually gone backwards when every other group they looked at, the life expectancy had gone up. And I think there were 3 or 4 reasons, and it was liver failure, suicide, I think alcohol poisoning, and something else, and maybe diabetes. And it was just all, they called them deaths of despair. And it's rampant in some of those counties, you know, places like Indiana, Ohio, Illinois. It's difficult. And yeah, I think the members who are most interested in dealing with those issues now tend to have obviously come from constituencies like that.
That is scary.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, sir.
You mentioned, I think the very first question, you were talking about correlation. So a lot of your data correlates, but how do you move from the correlation to cause and effect? Because I got the impression that you weren't, when you start to make hypotheses, but they're kind of hard to test.
Right, and I'm not in, my day job keeps me pretty busy. I'm doing this kind of on the side because I'm curious about it. And I find it interesting, and I share it with professionals in Washington who all find it surprising. They haven't heard some of the same stuff before, and they didn't know some of those correlations. Yeah, I think you'd have to be a more, like I said, second, third level of analysis to try to see what all matches up. And I'm not sure if you can prove any causation anyway. I just think it's more, when you tend to get a certain kind of constituency, the outcome tends to be a certain way politically. And I don't know, maybe you can look at it at different levels of politics. If the member going to the House is of one party, what about the state rep, the state senators from that same region, or the mayors, or the, you know, elected officials further down? Is the same thing hold true, or is there suddenly a divergence? So there's a lot of additional work to be done, and I'm not holding this out as being the, you know, like a peer-reviewed study that's going to be competing for the Nobel Prize, right? So, but I want to share it because it is something that shows up all the time in the policy debates. You can just, whether the members realize it or not, the ones who tend to self-select into certain debates and out of other debates, it matches up with the kind of people they tend to go home to on weekends and so on. Yes, sir.
Is there anything about medical spending? Like medical expenses and the deductions that people take?
Yeah, I don't have any of that category of data. I'm trying to think of, there might be something I could find on like level of insurance coverage. I think the census numbers do break that out. I can even look that up. But I don't have that in my little handy dandy spreadsheets. So. How about you? And we'll come back.
I wonder if you had sort of looked and compared the work that you've done with the work that Raj Chetty has done, looking at sort of rates of mobility like within counties. And I think that sort of tells, I mean, somewhat overlapping, but often different story. I mean, in some places different stories. So like you take a place like San Francisco and there's lots of mobility in a place like that. You go to a kind of, there's no exactly comparable city, but a similar type city in a different region of the country, you can get very low rates of mobility. And I wondered if you sort of have thought about sort of folding that into.
There's a couple of things along those lines. There is a study that makes sense to me. And first of all, one of the umbrella things to look at on this, you ever hear the book called The Big Sort? Bill Bishop wrote it, I think, and he was actually a CWA panelist one year, a nice fella. And his whole book was basically looking at the tendency of people to self-select when they move into like-minded communities. So subsequent to that, I saw a study, and it was looking at the zip code. When you move from one zip code to another, the political complexion of the zip code from which you are moving to the one you move to, it tends to be that the people who are inclined to be either right or left were moving to an area that was more right or more left. So that they were self-selecting into things, to a deeper shade of red or blue based upon where they were living, or more than their neighbors were. And that was going on little by little over a long period of time. And I do think the voting patterns and just the feel, of a lot of these communities, you see it. You can almost know now when you're walking around what it's like. And I'm kind of like this, stranger from another world, that I'm in D.C. and I have the views I have. And it's kind of fun, but it's definitely different than if you go to some place that's very conservative, and the tone, the temper, the feel of that. I think people are sorting themselves, and I think there's maybe your question was also about just generally, can people be more mobile? And there's studies about how many people are willing to move for a job as opposed to before. And I think there's a lot going on there too, that Silicon Valley is a magnet for people from all over the world to come in and work. New York is like that, there's certain cities like that. In other areas, once people just don't see that as an option, they don't even think about moving. Like if you read the Hillbilly Elegy book by J.D. Vance, that was part of the problem a lot of his neighbors and his family members had, is that they got stuck in a situation, and when something bad happened, they didn't see an outlet. Well, maybe I'll just move to another city, another community, and try and start over or get a job in a different area. They didn't see those options as being even plausible. So I think there's a lot to what you say. Yeah.
Do you have a demographic explanation why the Republican Party has gone more conservative over the last maybe 5-10 years? It's gone more far right. Is there a demographic piece in that?
I'm not sure. Well, it's a sorting. So the South becoming more heavily Republican is a big part of that, because once a seat, once you had a blue dog Democrat retire or decide to run for another office and that seat opened up, it almost is surely not just could be a Republican, but a Republican that would win the primary, which tended to be the most conservative. So the primary dynamic is very important because it works in both parties day to day. So the Democrats, when you have 2 or 3 candidates running, you tend to see the winner coming out of the more left-leaning of those candidates, and Republicans the opposite. So the ones that end up getting on the ballot for election day, the voters have a choice between somebody way out here and somebody way out there. And the caucuses kind of show that over time. And in the Northeast, a lot of the seats that used to be able to send, they used to call them Rockefeller Republicans, or more like these New England Republicans, Silvio Conte, people like that, who really weren't conservative. They might have been Republicans for other reasons. New Haven is a good example. In New Haven, Connecticut, the mayor for a long time were Irish. The Irish kind of controlled the city machine, and then there was an influx of Italians into New Haven. And the last thing they wanted to do was be in the same party with those Irish, right? So they all became Republicans, not because they were conservative, but that was their route to getting elected. And next thing you know, you had Italian mayors in cities like New Haven or Rhode Island because of that kind of dynamic. So, but at some point, the sorting became ideological. And your question in a way is what prompted that? I think Reagan had a lot to do with that. I think the the kind of ideological battles that were being waged toward the end of the Cold War and during the 80s over budget, tax, role of government. I think part of it too, for me, is speculation here, but when you had the Great Society programs being enacted and created in the mid-60s, and then it took a couple of few years for the funding streams to get in place and start becoming significant, it wasn't until somewhere in the 70s that they were completely up and running and they were growing and the bureaucracies were expanding and so on. And then you got kind of a pushback from that. You had the court decisions that were implementing it and a lot of heavy-handed ways that the government was trying to accomplish one or another policy goal. And there was a pushback, and so people were grasping for why are we unhappy with this outcome? You know, the Bronx is burning down. I don't like what's going on here. Oh, I have an answer, and then it's rent control or it's something else. The government's doing something wrong, and you had an ideological explanation and remedy for something that was gnawing at you and maybe disrupting your life or causing you to move to a suburb or move your kid from one school to another or whatever, or getting mugged, you know, on the way to school, that kind of thing. So I think that had a lot to do with the sorting, and President Reagan became a voice for that and inspired a lot of other people, both intellectuals but also practitioners in politics, to put themselves into the arena and echo that in different ways. Jack Kemp, you know, was a very elegant and articulate proponent of using markets and empowerment strategies to help solve the same problems that the Great Society programs are trying to solve, you know. And at some point it got locked in, and the ideology is just almost completely separate now. So, I mean, sorry if you heard this before my CWA talks, but early 80s, National Journal would do these, you know, began doing these analysis, and they looked at votes in the previous year, House and Senate, 3 categories: social issues, economic issues, national and foreign policy issues, national security, foreign policy. 70, 60, 70, 80 votes in each silo. And they'd rank all the members according to being most liberal to most conservative in each of these areas. When they started off, they measured the political middle by how many members were between the most conservative Democrat and the most liberal Republican. In the early years they started, there were 54 senators in that space. Lowell Weicker, you remember Lowell Weicker, right? Was the most liberal Republican. And remember who was the most conservative Democrat? Ed Zorinsky of Nebraska, right? And there were 52 others in between them. 2010, the most liberal Republican was George Voinovich of Ohio. Most conservative Democrat was Ben Nelson of Nebraska, again, Nebraska. But Ben Nelson on these scorecards was more liberal than George Voinovich. There was no overlap at that point. In the House, in the early 80s, there was 344 members between those two extremes. Ed Schau of California, who I think had a district like in Silicon Valley, which, imagine a Republican getting elected in Silicon Valley today. But he was the most liberal Republican, so, you know. And then I forget who the most conservative Democrat was, but 344 in that space. 2010 and since, it was 6 people in 2010. In the 2010 election, it was 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans. So 3 Republicans in that space. Remember what Ann Richards said about being in the middle of the road? It's the most dangerous place to be for politicians and for armadillos, right? And the 3 Republicans who were in that space all lost, and they were the only Republicans to lose. The only one. Every other Republican incumbent who ran won, and that was the big year for the Republicans, right? But they did lose 3, and they were those 3 of all the people. And the 3 Democrats, 2 of the 3 lost for sure. I forget the third. And the point being that that middle now is completely gone. You know, it varies year to year, Congress to Congress. Occasionally you get a person who accidentally gets elected in some seat, and they're the, you know, man out of Elvis Costello's man out of time, or whatever. But I think that has a lot to do with it. And once they got separate like that, you have tribes, and the tribes spawn, you know, groupthink, and the peer pressure is really great. And it's very common now, and it didn't used to be. It's very common to begin a legislative strategy with what we used to call it a 218 vote strategy, which means you have to get all your 218 votes, which is the majority in the House, 435 members, out of one party, meaning the Republican Party. So if you had 233 votes, play with. You could lose how many? 15 at most. You needed that 218. And you couldn't count on any Democrats. And every so often you'd get a few, but the working assumption day to day, vote to vote, issue to issue was it's a party line vote, especially if it comes out of committee and it's a party line vote in committee. So, yeah, I'm not sure whether that's good or bad, but.
You worry me a little bit that we'll never come together because we have to be we have to be in the gutter on one side or the other, and you can't be in the middle of the road, and this is very frustrating to me. But also, and I'd like to comment on, you talked about what happened.
Mm-hmm.
Another lady wrote about it. And last spring they had a little lecture on how did we get it so wrong. And they talked about it was because of racism, sexism, fundamentalist Christians did this. It was interesting in there that there was not a single person that would raise their hand and say they voted for Trump.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting to hear you actually try to go out and get some data and try to put this in perspective and tell us a little bit more of what happened. I appreciate that.
Sure. Well, like that's an example where you might be able to test that stuff if you could get, samples of, there are surveys on religiosity. How often do you go to church? Never, a couple times a year, monthly, weekly, multiple times a week, every 3 hours, right? So you can start matching some of that stuff up and try to draw some conclusions from it. And that's, again, that's an ambitious study. I think it should be done, though. I think there should be, to the extent we have all this stuff broken out in different ways, counties or congressional districts, obviously by state, and start looking at it and matching it up and trying to draw something from that. It would be really helpful. Because it is a problem. I think there's so many issues where because you have this mindset you can only work off of within one tribe, that you never get exposed to another way to skin the cat, so to speak, or a real desire to try to figure out a way to have two disparate points of view, find common ground. And there are a lot of areas where you could probably do that, but it doesn't happen. There's really no talking to each other as much as there is past or at each other. And I've thought about this for a long time, and I'm not sure how you change the sociology of the institution at this point. It'll happen. Right now, it's not ready to happen.
How about a third party? A third of our
that's normally
unaffiliated.
I think in history, that's usually there's some, gnawing problem that's eating away at the country, and both of the existing parties are coming at it from different ways, and this fault line is cutting across both parties. And how does it resolve itself, right? I mean, slavery, neither of the two parties were able to address slavery in an acceptable way, and you had the third party. Republicans are formed and Whigs went away. I think, modern liberalism was something that, both parties were grappling with for a while. Theodore Roosevelt tried to turn the Republican Party into a progressive party back in the, when he ran in 12 and everything before. Woodrow Wilson tried to seize that and internalize that into the Democratic Party with some success, but not a whole lot. And eventually it took Roosevelt to do it, but it didn't require a third party. But there were efforts. There were people, La Follette getting elected in Wisconsin. There were third party efforts. There were mayors, there were House members coming in from some of these other sources, but it never took root.
Well, how do you keep a third party from being an armadillo?
I think it just has to be a point where neither of the two parties is able, for coalitional or financial or other reasons, to address whatever that problem happens to be. And another group comes along and says, well, we have an answer, we're going to address this. And enough people say, well, we've given both of the other parties a chance and they haven't done it, let's try this new group, and they take off. But that hasn't happened yet. There hasn't been that. And I'm not even sure. One of the problems we're going to run into is the big problem we're all going to have is going bankrupt at some point before too much longer, right? And how do you address that? And how do you, when you have this sort of a latent disease, you don't wait till it manifests itself to start taking your medication or doing what you have to do. You have to do that really early on and recognize it. That's what we should be doing here, and we're not. So we're going to one day get this financial crisis, and Another party's going to want to address either cutting something or increasing taxes or whatever, but it's going to be a real problem. How do we deal with it then?
What about the group No Labels? How are they doing?
I think they're gone.
Well, I keep getting emails.
Are they still in existence?
I think so.
Yeah, I know. I mean, they were in existence in front of the election during the primary season, right? I haven't heard about them in a long time. Yeah, to be honest. May just be my emails feed. Yeah.
I'm wondering about your thoughts on gerrymandering. I think it plays an important role in several of the comments, things you've commented on, but it hasn't been specifically mentioned. I personally think it's not getting nearly the attention it deserves. I think it's a threat to our democracy, and maybe that's overstated, but you have lots of experience, so what do you think?
I mean, gerrymandering is funny because I don't know if you remember, the Wall Street Journal in the 80s used to periodically run these editorials where they would have a drawing of a district, the district lines, and it looked like some kind of crazy ink blot. And he's usually complaining about California. I think the two brothers, forget their last name, would draw the lines and they would carve out all these districts. The thing though is that back then, the crazy looking districts were usually there to, I guess, help the liberals get seats for the most part, right? And because the people weren't as sorted cleanly as they are today. Today, if you go for, district lines that look like geometric shapes, circles, squares, triangles, you're going to get overwhelming pockets of one party or the other because of the way people have sorted. So if you've decided to draw a bunch of circles or squares in Brooklyn, you're going to get 85, 90% districts. If you wanted to try to, if you're a Democrat trying to spread those votes out, you're going to have a line that goes and captures, parts of Long Island, and in order to get a 60-40 district. Otherwise, you're going to get, there's no people left in Brooklyn, and there's 3 million people there. So you get like 7 or 8 districts where it's one party seat. And the same is going to be true in these red areas. You could draw a line and all the counties are going to be 60, 70% one way. So I think what you'd probably get if you had what used to be the reform mentality for gerrymandering was have districts that respect political lines like counties or geographic lines like rivers, where people have kind of shared identities. If you have one county and you have 4 congressional districts that meander in and out of it, and you may think of yourself as being part of Montgomery County, but you have no idea whose district you're in, right? And the idea was to stop that and have there be, if I'm from this county, I'm also probably in Congressman so-and-so's seat, But if you did that today, I think you'd end up getting more non-competitive seats rather than having some kind of, the idea behind the geometric shapes is that you might get more competitive seats because you're randomly putting people together, not with a crazy line that's seeking a majority.
But what you're saying suggests that the people drawing the bizarre shapes are doing it in order to make districts more competitive. And that seems absurd.
Well, but there's a lot of seats now that are, if you look at them, they're not that, it's not like it used to be. I think there are a lot more relatively contiguous seats because you don't have to. Like if you're trying to get your margins and you're going to have the same motivations. I don't think anyone's motivations on line drawing has changed. Humans are humans. It goes back to whenever it started. But I think just the output or the outcome, the product of that work is going to have a different look today than it would have 30 years ago. Because of so many regions now just being stacked high with people of one point of view or another.
But I don't know that you're really addressing the point that he's trying to make. You're having situations in a couple of different states where the gerrymandering has just been so extreme that the Republicans are receiving 54% of a vote and they're taking 66% of the seats. So it's clear in that situation that the district boundaries that were drawn, and very purposely drawn that way, had the desired effect. So you can't just throw up your hands and say that there's nothing we can do here.
But you're right. I don't know the example in every single state, but you can posit 2 different examples. One is that if everyone is stacked in one geographic area, you know, you can get 5 or 6 districts where one party is going to get 80, 90% of the vote, and every district has about 730,000 people, right? So they're going to get like 90% of those votes. Statewide, that's a big number, right? But it's a small number of seats relative to that because they're all stacked in fewer districts.
So that's part of the intention as well, right? Packing and cracking.
But packing has been done voluntarily by people moving into these places, right? That's the thing that I don't think was as...
If you actually look at the boundaries that are being drawn, yes, of course, there's self-sorting going on, right? Mm-hmm. There are people that are expressly looking at maps and just moving the line in a totally absurd fashion, instead of having a much more open and random algorithm that is going to pick out numbers in not as deliberate a fashion.
Yeah,
but and this court, of course, I mean, this case is before the Supreme Court, so we're going to find out whether or not someone is going to really be able to say that mathematically you should not be able to get that number of seats out of that number of votes, period. Right?
But then it means you're going to try to preordain an outcome by partisan affiliation.
It means that, yes, there's going to be new maps.
Because that could mean a lot more crazy lines. They could solve that problem.
Well, I think some states have tried to move in the direction of going to, you know, actually public citizens being on the commission to draw the maps rather than having the maps being drawn by either political party.
And yet, and state laws would have to determine that, yeah.
Of course, state, yes. And you know, who's going to give up their power first,
right? Right. So, I mean, you're kind of stuck with this in a way, but I hear your thing.
How are they doing it in California, you know?
Well, they have the jungle primary now, and they have a commission, I think, process to draw lines. And I don't think any incumbents, I think all the incumbents won last election. So that's your answer, I think. Yeah.
Has your analysis given any hint that open primaries produce less polarized candidates?
You mean that not having party primaries is having everyone run in the general?
Something like that, yeah.
Or you mean everyone runs and the top 2, California's doing it with the top 2 get into the general. Is that something like that?
I was thinking more of one can sign up for and vote in one primary.
I mean, I think there's a limited pool of examples, and I don't think the California experience, which they've had 2 or 3 cycles now where they've done that, has yielded different kinds of, you know, you're not necessarily getting a lot of moderates coming out of that process. The interesting dynamic though was, like, I think it was in the Senate race that Sanchez was running, and the woman who, Camille, what's her name? Harris, yeah. She had locked in the kind of the hard left activist vote, and Sanchez actually made a play for the Republican vote in that jungle primary, and it didn't really work because she hadn't done much over the years to cultivate or be kind to the Republican voters. They didn't like her, but that's an interesting type of thing that could happen. You know, you could end up with a politician saying, if I'm going to get elected, and this one opponent is nailing down everything from, say, 7 to 10 on the scale, on the spectrum, and I want to get that 3 to 7 area, you know, I'm going to have to make alliances with people I never did before, or hey, I'm more moderate, I can go in and get this spectrum of votes. That might result in it over time. So, but it requires, I don't think it would allow someone like an incumbent who has a long record of being a partisan suddenly saying, hey, I changed my mind, you know? So, yeah.
Out of the 435 congressional districts, how many do you think are competitive?
Very few, I'd say under 40, maybe 30 at most, in a demographic sense, where they can go. You can imagine them going either way.
And is gerrymandering more a Republican problem or a Democratic problem or both?
It's a problem of if it's a problem indeed, it's a problem of whatever party controls the different processes at different times. So right now, I think it's 68 out of 98 or 69 out of 98 state legislative chambers are Republican controlled, maybe one fewer with Virginia if that flips. And 35 or 34 governorships. I think 34 now. So they have a lot of control. And in there's very, very few states where the Democrats have all 3 players at the table drawing the lines. And there's a lot of states where Republicans control all three, and then there's a handful where there's a mixed bag. So, yeah.
This morning I read an article about communities in Wisconsin that flipped from Obama to Trump. And one of the poignant parts of this article was that the uncertainty and insecurity that parents felt because of loss of jobs, loss of opportunity, and these are all mostly high school graduates or even not even high school graduates. So it strikes me that when people are insecure and uncertain, they tend to look for authority. And in the last presidential election, it's clear that Donald Trump had charismatic properties that would have persuaded these people to vote for him.
And he talked to them. I mean, he was speaking directly to them every day. And one of the things, by the way, I think it's worth contemplating, it's another perhaps disturbing thing, factor, is Trump got 68% of the non-college educated white vote. Romney got 58. No, McCain got 58, Romney got 61. Trump gets 68. That's in the territory of becoming an identity group, the way African Americans and Hispanics and Asians are African American groups. They're higher. They're at 98, 95%, and 80, 75, 80% for the Hispanics and the Asians. But if you get a group that, according to the exit polls, was about a third of the turnout of the whole country, but according to the study by Roy Teixeira at CAP, could be 45% of the whole turnout. Because they looked at, I don't know what techniques they used, but they came up with a higher percentage. If 45% of the country decides that we're an identity group, right, and another 25% are three different identities, you have like 70% of people deciding, because I have a certain affiliation, whether it's racial or ethnic or whatever, I have to vote a certain way in big numbers. It's not America that I grew up with. You know, it's a different kind of country. It's the level of ability to persuade and win people over and all that starts going down the tubes, and it just becomes a, you know, it's a different kind of an electoral process, and it bothers me personally quite a bit. And I, you know, what's to say it's not going to be 70 or 71 pretty soon? And I think both parties have to figure out ways to take some of the steam out of that one.
Just very germane to your point, just 8 days ago in the Washington Post, John Bard, who's a professor of social psychology at Yale, wrote about this, and one of his statements is, conservatives, it turns out, react more strongly to physical threat than liberals do, which is exactly the point we're making. And he talks about studies that have been done and all that sort of thing. So, yeah, Trump definitely.
Do you ever read the Righteous Mind?
I haven't read it.
It's, what's his name?
Jonathan Haidt.
Yeah, Jonathan Haidt. It's worth reading. It's an interesting, same along the lines, the economy of how liberal minds and conservative minds approach things and the value systems that they prioritize and all that. Just someone's hand was up.
I had another question.
Yeah.
This is a little bit of a hot button issue, but do you have any profiles, statistics, or perceptions about the red-blue brouhaha that's going on in Alabama, and any speculation if Roy Moore goes ahead and wins, how D.C. might respond?
Well, I think he'd be something of a pariah if he wins, and you know, I think that's an example of where, you know, he is a manifestation of some of these changing demographics by party. So if you go back in history and look at some of the Southern politicians from mid-century, all of whom were Democrats, Roy Moore kind of fits that profile. You know, he's coming out of that tradition and all that, and suddenly he's viable as a statewide candidate as a Republican. That things have turned around a lot. And I think, going back to the question about trust, the whole point about trust, if people don't trust certain institutions, I mean, there's a lot of people that probably don't believe a word of what's being said about him, where at another time there might have been a higher level of, oh my gosh, this is happening, I changed my mind or whatever, right? So I think he's, you know, benefiting from some of this balkanization, the people living in silos and not trusting information coming from places they don't want to hear it from. But I don't know, I have no idea whether he's going to win or lose. I don't know enough about his opponent. My suspicion is that, and my instinct is that if the opponent is relatively moderate, he can pick up a lot of disgruntled Republicans. If he's viewed as being kind of part of the tribe, so to speak, and will vote party line on everything, then they may say, well, wait a minute, you know, Supreme Court justices or whatever are more important, and we'll roll the dice on this guy. But I don't know enough about the Democrat, what his beliefs are and all that. Bob.
How do you break the cycle of identity politics, which I think is bad, and in many ways, however, this is a consequence of what the left in general on the university campus has sowed. That for 40 years on university campuses, and it's permeated into the body politic, the identity politics of the left, structural racism, gender politics, and now what goes around comes around, and people are absolutely startled that white males are reacting in the same way. How are you going to break this cycle unless all sides step back from this brink? And
I think you just answered the question. It just might be seeing what it looks like when it's directed against you. Should give some people a sense of, okay, wait a minute. How do we unravel this? How do we deconstruct this? And
but it doesn't seem, at least in a preliminary way, and it's early, that we've made much progress, because when we're still calling Trump voters collectively without making reasonable distinctions, deplorables, racists, xenophobes, without taking seriously that they may have, not all of it, a legitimate point where we were before.
We're not there at all. Well, how do we get there? I think it just has to be, there has to be somebody who's willing to be a disparate voice and say, wait a minute, you know, like, who is it? Mark Lilla wrote a book on identity politics and the problems with it. He may not be a prominent enough voice, but it has to be stored up in places like that, and it has to become more of a common theme, and it has to come from both sides, I think, at the same time.
Wouldn't you say that the reason we have identity politics is because when we go online, we search out certain websites and the computer recognizes that and starts feeding it to us, so it becomes a vicious cycle? And likewise, now we have pundits instead of journalists on news, so people seek out the station that agrees with their points of view. So we're just being fed more of what we believe instead of listening to both sides.
I mean, I think that's what happens. I also think it's incumbent upon, you know, think about universities, right, to not validate that, not inculcate that into a student from the beginning, that this is the way to see the world. You know, I'm on the board of a group that's trying to offer a broader set of views on my undergraduate institution, and we held a conference about a year and a half ago, or a little over a year ago, on the campus, 100, 150 people. The topic of the conference was the condition of free speech on college campuses. And it was in the wake of the email about Halloween that had happened at the Yale master had sent one around, his wife sent around, and the students were yelling at him. If you remember that whole episode, right? And so this is a week after that. It was on the Yale campus. And one of the speakers had been a guest for that master and his wife, and had like a tea, and he runs an organization that defends academics who get, have their views challenged or suffer consequences for their points of view. It's called FIRE, it's an acronym. And he was telling the story, because we had not really heard it at that point. And he said, he read from the email. It was a very mild email. It was just, you know, don't let anyone tell you what to wear, what not to wear. Be progressive and transformative and do what you want to do. Your kids, have fun, right? He said, well, it's not like she was actually urging that we burn down Indian villages, quote unquote. Someone in the room heard that and tweeted out, there's a bunch of conservatives in Lindsley Chit, which is the name of the hall, advocating the burning down of Indian villages. And within about an hour, it was a Friday afternoon, there were 150 students outside the classroom chanting, genocide is not a joke, having thought that we were advocating genocide for Indians in villages, I guess. And one guy broke into the room and had to be escorted out by a campus policeman, and on the way out, one of the people got spat upon, and I was looking in the eyes of these students, and they were, I've never seen anything like it. All I could think of was, the Cultural Revolution in China, with these 13-year-olds taking people's glasses and then killing them, right? And I don't think they got there naturally. I think those students have arrived at that point. I don't think they came to campus that hateful and that narrow-minded. I think that had to be given to them serially over a lot of classes, a lot of exposure to professors, and I think that's part of the problem. They don't get the alternative point of view. Well, how about you? You've already spoken. Go ahead. I'm just trying to find new hands.
So, I mean, you already told us earlier when you talked about educational demographics, right? That who was voting for who. But the percentage of people in the country that are actually college students is certainly below 50%. So how are we going to get this information that you're talking about? Yes, the college campuses, they're terrible, very narrow-minded. How are you going to get that to the other 60% of the people that aren't even getting near it?
Well, that's where you get into your point about going in silos on stations or websites or whatever. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, a lot of people go through college now and become leaders, and they're more likely to vote, they're more likely to be engaged. And if they're being told, when they hear the word conservative, they think it's synonymous with being a racist, a fascist, a homophobe, and whatever else, right? That's not a good start to a discussion. And yet they get that in the universities. In the Heterodoxy is a good website that captures a lot of this stuff, and it's liberal professors and conservative professors that have come together.
Yeah, but there's an opportunity somewhat, I think, at least to have a discussion in that environment, whereas if you went to a small town in Ohio and you went to a diner, okay, the shoe would be really on the other foot. If you had a bunch of people that were working in a manufacturing industry locally, there sure is not going to be anyone defending a college student in that environment, and they're going to have all of their bigotries and all of their attitudes that no one speaks out against either, right?
It'd be nice to be able to, everyone to get a wider array of views, and that's my main point. I agree.
Before we take the next question, we have to save the intrepid Michael from himself. There'll be 3 more questions, then there'll be a reception outside, and I don't think you should plan that it's going to be dinner. The university's going to do it. It will be refreshments. So Michael will answer 3 more questions. Then we will prepare for the reception after giving Michael a jolly, rousing hand of applause. Michael, 3 more, and I'm going to cut it off.
1, 2, 3.
Okay. I think regarding the upcoming tax reform, I see there's some real panic coming in the city. Somehow, I think a lot of people got an impression that, especially those graduate students, they will have to pay like triple amount of tuition, because tuition it has been like tax-free, but somehow they got a strong impression that they have to pay all these kind of scholarship or something as a research associate or teaching associate. So I think the university sent out some emails to clarify. So I think it's probably a little bit of panic at the university side. So my question is that I know a lot of graduate students, there might be a reason that the tax bill, or especially the Senate tax bill, has that kind of new, sort of change. And but I just have a little bit concern, because I think that, for example, the STEM program, I noticed like the United States having giving opportunity to a lot of foreign graduate students in the STEM program, like science and math and technology. And I think somehow the international environment might change. Those then foreign students might not come. So therefore, I think it's very crucial for the United States to keep a very strong STEM program. So is that possible to have an exception for those graduate STEM students to still be able to encourage to go pursue their talent?
Well, I had this discussion in my last meeting here, and I'm not sure what motivated, aside from the search for dollars. Like when you're doing a tax bill, and you know what you want to accomplish in terms of cuts, and then you add that up and it's scored by the Joint Tax Committee as reducing revenues by, say, $1 trillion, then you start looking for some money to offset that. And I don't know what the score was on this provision, but it might have been enough that said, well, we need that money in order to help balance everything else. And yeah, this is a benefit. Graduate students go on and statistically make a lot more money than people who don't have graduate degrees, so it's okay. They can go into more debt or something. I mean, they pay tax on the value of what they're getting. Some of them want to, I don't think this is in the bill, but you work, you travel, you fly a lot, you run up a lot of miles on your own personal account, and you have suddenly enough miles to take a ticket, buy a ticket for yourself, for your own personal use. It's not viewed as income. You can get a $500 ticket off miles you accrued while doing work, and that $500 is not taxed. Some people have said they should tax it. There's all these weird, these interesting concepts of how you assess taxes and benefits.
I also heard some people said that if the university itself doesn't consider these kind of salary, which is teaching associate or researcher associate as salary, then if they write it out, use a different code, such as scholarship or something, then it's tax-free.
It's called loophole. Trying to find a loophole around. So I'm just not sure. I don't know enough about it, but I heard it from a lot of grad students earlier, in that meeting I was at earlier today.
Especially the STEM.
They're all upset. Yeah, and they're worried.
Like I saw maybe more than half or close to half of the graduate STEM students are from overseas. So it's nice and important to have a STEM program that's strong in the United States as well. Yeah, thank you.
Sorry.
Quick and dirty. Where do you see in the future our electoral college versus popular vote? Go on.
I don't think the electoral college is going anywhere anytime soon.
You don't think so?
I think my great-great-great-grandchildren will be dealing with the electoral college.
Final question.
So you've described sort of an environment of increasing partisanship, and it seems that that's been combined with weakened party institutions, one of the big institutions that we've weakened. I wonder if you see that as contributing to extremism. In particular, I think both parties, but probably in particular the Republican Party in the last election, nominated someone that the establishment was very unhappy with, that was widely unpopular. So do you see a path for strengthening party institutions, and do you think that that would have an effect on?
Well, yeah, I think you're putting your finger on something important, because the party was a way to help create a sense of almost like control in a benevolent sense for candidates and incumbents, that they could help be the conduit for raising a lot of money, for providing a lot of endorsements and so on. And that's, in many cases, gone by the wayside. Not everywhere, but enough places that you can find independent routes to becoming a viable candidate without ever having to deal with the local or the county or the state party or the national party, right? So that tends to create a lot more free agents. And when I was up there most recently, I had worked for a majority leader in the mid-90s, and then I'd worked for Kevin McCarthy almost like 18 years later. And the leadership back in the 90s and before had a lot of tools to use to try to create discipline and cohesiveness with within your ranks. And the party was one way to do that, help raise money and all that for a person running. But the other way was earmarks, which used to be a way to say, okay, if you want an earmark for your district to do X, Y, and Z, I need your vote over here on these appropriations bills or these other bills that might be tough for you. Okay, well, I really need to get that thing. well, earmarking is a problem for a lot of levels, but one of the consequences of banning earmarks has been that there's one less way that people in leadership can try to put something over the finish line, legislatively speaking. And I think, so there's a lot of things pulling away at what used to be the glue that enabled certain bills to go over the finish line. And I think that's it, right? Okay.
That's it. Please, Mike.